Hey, thank you all so very much. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be here. I find myself wandering through this part of the country a lot. I have two grandsons, my son and my daughter-in-law, just about half an hour from here. And we just feel led of the Lord to show up in this area a lot. And I appreciate your pastor and his kindness and graciousness to give us a chance to preach tonight. My throat has been a little rough today. It's a little better than it was, but I just pray you would bear with me. I was just like everybody else. I was kind of grounded, for a while. And most of the meetings I had were canceled over a 3-month period, and just back on the road the last 3 weeks. And last Wednesday night, I was in Marion, North Carolina, and the pastor there asked if I would preach a message on the foundation and future of the United States. And I thought maybe we'd take a look at that again tonight, and I'd like to ask you to go to Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 34. We're surrounded with challenges to our very existence as a nation, and these challenges come from people who completely misquote our history and what our nation is all about. So let me just mention the books I have out in the foyer. Since I was 17, when I surrendered to call to full-time Christian work, I said, Lord called me to be a history teacher and a preacher. It might sound like a funny combination for folks. I went to Bible college to be a preacher, but God just immediately, after Bible college, opened up doors for me to be involved in teaching history. I've taught history classes at 3 colleges, at Indiana Baptist College in Indianapolis, Landmark Baptist College over in Haines City, Day Spring Bible College, which is at my home church up in Lake Zurich, Illinois. And then had a chance to do some writing and some other speaking and teaching about it. And I will tell you, if it's not understood, we get into a difficult situation real easily. The goal of all of my writing and the goal of my preaching is to take the complicated and make it simple. I did not say that was to be the goal of everybody's writing and preaching. It's what God called me to. Let me say a word about the books in the foyer. I have 2 volumes there about United States history, 2 volumes about world history, and I know some folks might be quick to say, well, that just doesn't interest us, Christian. It ought to. We are dealing with these issues every single day. Turn on your television, news show, any day, and you'll see these issues dealt with. And I've written on world history and United States history first of all, from a Christian perspective. Okay? It's very important how you look at things. And secondly, I've written it from what they used to call a popular history perspective. What they meant by that is that it was designed to tell the story. There are 2 ways to write a history book. What's called popular perspective, which is almost forgotten in our culture. And then, thank you, the textbook approach, which literally nobody ever reads, unless you're assigned it in a school classroom somewhere, and even then, pretty much nobody ever reads it. And popular history has dropped out of view in our country, and it's really a shame that it has. And I have said for several years that the new pagans who want to paganize America have to do 2 things. Take our Bible away from us and rewrite our history. They can't do it without doing those 2 things. And so anyway, those history books are out there. This book called The Transformation, it's subtitled America's Journey to the Darkness. I wrote it back in the 1990s. It has been updated by another brother. And how the process, how the United States moved from being a Christian nation to being a pagan nation. What happened? I also have a book back there called The Unbroken Bible, The Incredible History, Accuracy, and Legacy of the King James Bible. And then I have another book called Faithful Baptist Witness, tells the story of our Baptist heritage. Man, oh man, do we need these things today. So books are back there on the table. I tell folks, I'll answer any questions you might want to ask me about the books, except for one. There's one question that irritates me. People will come up, no, I have signs back there on the left. People will come up, I'm standing by a table full of books with my name on them because I wrote them or co-wrote them. And they'll say, which one do you recommend? Let me help you with that. I recommend every book with my name on it, so you don't have to ask me that. What a day that we live in. It's incredible. And we see basic values that we have thought were standard in our country under absolute utter attack from every angle. Would you look with me in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 34? Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. That is very clear here. A nation can be based on righteousness and can promote righteousness, or a nation can be based on sin and promote sin. It makes a difference in terms of what happens to the nation. Throughout history, nations have been formed for a lot of reasons. Some of them are neutral. Some of them have a great deal to do with good and evil. Sometimes, for example, Australia is the world's largest island, and it is bound together as a nation simply by its geography. It's not uncommon for nations to be formed by geography. They were the people on that side of the mountain, or the people between these two rivers. Sometimes nations formed by geography, which is a neutral reason. Sometimes a nation is formed as a tribal group binds together and separates themselves from all other tribal groups, and they form a nation. Sometimes a nation is built around a particular leader who may be mostly good. No leader is 100% good, but who may be mostly good, or who might be mostly evil, or somewhere in between. A nation can be formed around a specific family, which passes on leadership from generation to generation to generation. A nation can be formed around a religion. Islam is both a religion and a political philosophy. That is what makes it so different than the other religions of the world. Buddhism is false theology, but Buddhists are not seeking to conquer the world. Okay? Hinduism is a false world religion, but they are not seeking to conquer the world. They are not a threat. Islam has 5 basic teachings, one of which is the conquest of the whole world for Allah. That does make it a political issue. There are lots of different things that bind a nation together. The United States is unique in the history and forming of nations in this world. It was formed on an idea of limited government and due process of law. And people rallied around, those are Christian ideas, so people rallied around that. And I know folks today are quick to run and say, but wait a minute, what about this and what about that? Of course, it was carried out imperfectly. It was carried out by human beings. Everything done by human beings is imperfect. But much of the understanding given to folks about that today is completely inaccurate. Just for example, when the United States was formed, there was only one nation in the history, or one nation in the world that did not practice slavery. That was Ireland. Every other nation was a slave-owning nation, including, by the way, every African tribe practiced and owned slaves. In fact, every slave that came to the United States was first a slave in Africa. One tribe would conquer another, and they would make the folks they conquered slaves. There was no question about it. All 800 African tribes practiced it when they were powerful enough to. Some of their slaves would be sold. They would go to slave holding ports along the African coast. I have been to one in Ghana that is preserved as a museum of all that tragedy. And the curator, wonderful Christian man, I had great fellowship with him. And he pointed out how puzzling it was to them that people in the United States thought slavery was based on white supremacy, because every slave with black skin was first the slave of someone else with a black skin. And they were first their property. And then they sold them. And various nations learned to come by. There's not a single case, like you hear about, of white slave traders going into the jungle and kidnapping people. Had they tried that, they would not have lasted long. They came to these ports and purchased slaves that had already been enslaved by African tribes. By the way, 500 American Indian tribes, every single one of them practiced slavery. Now, I'm not defending slavery. It was wicked, horrible, abominable by every group that practiced it, was going against the plain revealed will of God in Scripture and challenging the Creator God as to the purpose of his creation. It was evil when practiced by white people. It was evil when practiced by black people. It was evil when practiced by red people. It was simply evil. But the idea that it was something developed by the United States built on the concept of white supremacy is completely untrue. Matter of fact, the United States was one of the first nations, not the first, that belongs to Ireland, and then England. But the United States was one of the first nations to lead the world in turning away from slavery, because slavery was completely inconsistent with the idea that the nation was founded upon. And there was this tension from the very moment that they met to discuss the Declaration of Independence. It came up. Later, when they're discussing the Constitution, it came up that slavery was inconsistent with the principles they were building a country on, and it was. The fact is, they couldn't figure out how to get out of it. It's easy to say it's evil and it's to be taken away, but when you have 2 million slaves, what do? You say, oh, by the way, tomorrow you're all free. Go where you want to, do as you please, live however you want. You're free now. The price tag financially of ending slavery was huge. And when people have a huge price tag, and they have a choice, they tend not to pay it, just put it off a little longer and put it off a little longer. By the way, they would have been much better off to have paid it and ended slavery, because as big as the price tag would have been, it was not as big as the price tag of the Civil War, which cost hundreds of thousands of lives, multiplied millions of dollars, and created sectional tensions that you might have noticed have not gone away yet. I used to joke when I lived in Florida that the folks down here were real good to me. They approved my visa every year when I came down here. I mean, as big as the price tag of ending slavery would have been, the price tag ended up being a whale of a lot bigger. But the fact is, when this was discussed, nobody knew what to do about it. Okay? Now let's make it clear. Righteousness exalts a nation. The United States was built upon a righteous idea. God exalted the nation for that, no matter how anybody wants to retell the story now. The United States, in the history of the world, is an absolutely unique thing. Nation gets started, normally is very weak and fumbling at first, and it's questionable how long it will last. The United States is started in a few years. It's the most powerful nation on the face of the earth economically. In a few years, it becomes one of the major military powers of the earth. And a little bit after that, it becomes the world's most powerful superpower as a nation. That's an unmatched story. And you have to ask, why did that happen? Because the United States was founded on an idea that gave it power and significance. And it had the blessing of God. My history books for U.S. history, I have entitled The Heaven Rescued Land. Because again and again, there has been reason to believe the United States would not survive. I believe it's been heaven rescued again and again. In the early days, when it was founded, people founded the United States in the Declaration of Independence. They declared themselves to be independent from England based on this idea of a limited government. Bible says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. But you know what you get if you finish that statement? Rendering to God the things that are God's. Everything does not belong to Caesar. That's limited government, because the Caesars all thought everything belonged to the Caesar. And by the way, just if you take that passage in Matthew and carry it through for a moment, the question was, the Lord's illustrating this principle. Everything doesn't belong to Caesar. Some things belong to Caesar, but everything doesn't. And he asks, whose image is on the coin? And he answers, Caesar. So, okay, who should coin or print money? Government should do that. That's pretty reasonable. Can you imagine what it would be like if we allowed every Baptist church to print its own money? Okay? I'm not in favor of giving that to the church. But while we're on that illustration, who's the church belong to? Whose image is on the church? Church is the body of Christ. So render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but render unto God the things that are God's. And while we're on that subject, whose image is on your children? And that can honestly be answered two ways. You could say the image of their parents. Okay? I've seen an awful lot of folks who an awful lot of folks who look like their parents. There's another way to answer that. Upon every child, there is the image of God, which right up front clears away any concept of defending slavery. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but render unto God the things that are God's. So this nation was founded on that. It was carried out inconsistently, but nonetheless it was there. And the idea was so powerful that it kept drawing the nation to improve itself. I know folks say, what about the Indians? Indians, all their land was stolen and all that. Go back and study your history again. There were less than 2 million Indians at any time during the frontier days in this country. Think about how big this country is for a population of 2 million. Okay? There are more than 2 million people on the south side of Chicago. The Indians roamed over a vast wilderness. Yes, they claimed all of it, or whatever they knew about, but they roamed over far more territory than they could ever use. And folks could not accept the idea that those 2 million people could be considered the owners of all this land that they did not use. On top of that, the Indians did not believe in ownership of the land. To them, that was a religious principle. They were proud of it. It's boasted about today. But the fact is, when nobody owns the land, you do not get to protest when somebody else comes and uses it. And when they tried to straighten all this out, rather than just being horrible conquerors, in treaty after treaty with the various Indian nations, every Indian was given title deed to 160 acres of land. By the way, when the settlers went west, claiming unused wilderness, you know what they could receive? 160 acres of land. Everybody was treated the same, but many of the American Indians refused to accept that. Some of them did. You go in Ohio, a lot of stories about Delaware Indians that took their 160 acres, and as a result became very wealthy. In Indiana, a lot of the Miami Indians accepted their 160 acres, became very wealthy landowners and farmers, and there was an attempt found to make a way to let everybody equitably share in this vast country with its incredible resources. Now, very honestly, there were times the United States government violated treaties. There were also times the Indians violated treaties. Righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. You can study moments in American history where the guiding principle was sin and not righteousness, and they are a shame to the country and to the people who were involved in them. That's the truth. It's, by the way, the truth in the history of every nation and every tribe and every group. There were other times you study American history, the United States acted in a righteous manner and it exalted the nation. And I will tell you without embarrassment that if you study American history, you will find more good being done for more people in more ways than in the history of any other nation in the history of the world. Righteousness exalteth a nation. It still does. It was the United States and England primarily, two most Christianized nations. You couldn't tell that at all in England today and barely tell it in the United States. But if you'll go back a period of time, the two most Christianized nations that defended and saved the world from Nazi fascism and Japanese imperialism. It was the United States and England that defeated the communists in their goal of taking over the world. When I was a kid in school, public school, we were taught that it was inevitable that communism would conquer the world, because they kept talking, they added this many countries this year, and 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 this many countries this year. Just inevitable. They're going to conquer the whole world. And then came Reagan and Thatcher. And after they became the leaders of the United States and Great Britain, the communists never took control over a nation again after that. It was the United States and Great Britain, and God, righteousness exalts a nation. Those were righteous causes. When American soldiers invaded the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, celebrated not very long ago, the president led the country in prayer, praying for them in this righteous cause and this righteous crusade. That was reasonable and noble. And by the way, you study this, you'll find again and again notable moments in the history of the United States, in the history of Dunkirk, when prayer made such a difference, because you had so many people who turned to the Lord and called on the Lord. And by the way, when the United States was founded, it comes at the end of a 50-year period people refer to as the Great Awakening. That is not coincidental. The Great Awakening was the most stirring revival in the history of the world since biblical times. The beginning of the Great Awakening, which took place in England and in the United States, in what were the colonies. In the colonies, when it starts, very few people go to church. There's very little interest in spiritual things. There's nothing to set it apart as a Christian group of people. 50 years of the greatest recorded revival in world history since biblical days. A majority of the American people belonged to churches that had the plan of salvation in their doctrinal statement. I can't read anybody's hearts, but there's every reason I believe most of those people believe that, and the majority of people were saved. And I believe if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you find the biblical concept of government described in Romans chapter 13, that government is a blessing to good and a terror to evil in Romans chapter 13. And the founders were saying, look, the British government has become a terror to good and operates in the defense of evil. And when you have a situation like that, it's your right and responsibility to change your form of government, to get a government that does what it's supposed to. Romans chapter 13 describes what a government's supposed to be. Again and again, you find prayers significant. World War II, when Britain, it looked like it could no longer restrain the Nazis. The British army's trapped in Germany, and they're wanting to get it back to England so that England can survive and try to stave off the German advances. And the German planes have sunk all the British transports. Nothing can get across the narrow range of the channel. 2 movies on this recently, and neither one of them mentioned this moment. The King of England goes on the radio and asks the English people to stop what they're doing and pray for a miracle from God. And unforecast clouds covered the English Channel. And in those days, the planes couldn't fly and all that. And the German planes couldn't fly. And the English people heroically grabbed everything that would float, went across the channel in garbage scows and yachts, and picked up their people. Now, you find a great deal of emphasis on that, and properly so. It's a wonderfully heroic moment. But if God doesn't answer that prayer first, that moment never takes place. I could go again and again in English history and American history, and you see this again and again, critical moments of prayer, and God answers. Okay? Righteousness exalteth a nation. When you're behaving righteously, you can ask for the blessing of God. Now, I will tell you a very interesting moment in America, because you can see both sides of this equation in America today. Abortion is as wicked, as much sin as anything could ever be. And abortion is prominent in the United States. Sin is a reproach to any people, and that's a reproach to us. Homosexuality and the public embrace of homosexual behavior is sin, and it's a reproach to any people that embrace it. So we get some real problems on the sin side of the equation here in the United States. On the other hand, we're still the nation that has done and is doing the most for religious liberty in our own country and around the world of any nation. That's on the righteousness side. We're still the nation that does more to provide freedom for oppressed peoples of the world than any other nation. That's on the righteousness side. We are still the nation that prevents Israel from being overrun and destroyed. That's on the righteousness side, and God promises a blessing to those that stand with the Jewish people. So we find ourselves in an interesting moment in the United States. Sin is a factor. Righteousness is a factor. And if you think I'm going to tell you what's going to happen next, trust me, I'm not. That's far beyond what I'm capable of. But I get this question all the time. Why can we not find the United States in prophecy? Because the book of Revelation gives us a pretty detailed look at what happens in the tribulation period. And there's nothing in there that could be the United States. That's somebody say, Babylon's the United States. No, Babylon's Babylon. The Bible is a lot easier to interpret than some people think it is. Okay? Babylon refers to Babylon. It was the dream of Saddam Hussein to rebuild Babylon. Somebody else is going to come along and it'll be their dream, and somebody else is going to rebuild it. So what in the world, why isn't the United States in the detailed discussion of the tribulation that refers to many nations? Well, I can explain that real simple. The United States is not here during the tribulation. There are two possible reasons for that. I don't know which one is true. One is that the United States, there's no guarantee it will last indefinitely. The United States collapses under the weight of its own sin and ceases to exist as a nation. When you're watching our cities burn, you can picture that, can't you? Or the United States lasts all the way up to the rapture, which I'm convinced from Scripture has to come before the tribulation, all the way rapture, and you take a nation that was founded on Christian principles and take every Christian out at once. You know what would happen to that nation the next day? It would collapse. Now, it's going to collapse someday. It might collapse whenever. I'm not a prophet. I have no idea what kind of time frame we're on. If it doesn't collapse before the rapture, it will collapse at the rapture. I don't know about you, but that's when I'm wanting it to collapse. Not now. I don't want to watch it. I don't want to see it. I have so much love after having spent 45 years as a preacher and as a history teacher. That was my calling from the beginning. It's what I have studied. It's what I have read about. It's what I have written about. It's what I have taught. It's what I've addressed. When I'm preaching, history examples show up in my sermons all the time. When I'm teaching history, Bible shows up in my history lessons all the time. For me, it has been one calling and one subject. I don't want to see it collapse. There have been times in the last few days when literally I wept for my nation. But I will tell you, again and again, there are moments folks thought the United States was done. During the War for Independence, we lost a number of key battles in a row, and our army barely survived the winters in Morristown and Valley Forge. And the British Parliament took it for granted the war was over and we'd lost. They might have called that too soon. During the War of 1812, the British burned our capital. and celebrated because they thought the war was over and the colonies were being retaken. Again, they might have celebrated a bit too soon. Nobody in Europe, they wrote about it was in the papers constantly, thought the United States could survive the Civil War. Let's admit, we came awfully close to not surviving it. And yet, we're still one nation. A lot of folks didn't think we could survive the Nazi juggernaut, which swept Europe. We not only survived it, we destroyed it. Folks didn't think we could stand up to the worldwide spread of communism. And Ronald Reagan said we would put it on the scrapyard of history. And we did in our lifetime. Wasn't long ago that militant Islam terrorism looked like it was going to sweep the world unopposed. And I don't mean to imply it's not still an issue, it is, but it don't look nearly as powerful as it did a few years ago. There were folks who looked at the 60s, the riots, the demonstrations, the promotion of evil and ungodliness, thought there's no way the United States is going to survive the 60s. But that was 60 years ago. Are we in a mess now? You'd better count on it. But my own study of history makes me believe again and again, you don't want to count the United States out. Last chapter hasn't been written. Okay. I believe that God has intervened again and again in this nation's history because righteousness exalts a nation. Okay? And there are still righteous things to exalt the United States. I wish I could tell you that was the whole record. It's not. Sin's a reproach to any people. I don't mean to imply there's no price tag for the sin that is prominent in the United States today. It's not mine to say. I'm not a prophet. I don't tell you what tomorrow looks like or 6 months from now or a year. But I weep for my country and I pray for my country. I wouldn't be praying for it if I thought it was over. Again and again, God's intervened in this nation. I'll say this quickly and close with it. There have been 3 sweeping revivals that swept across this country. The first was the Great Awakening that led to people studying the Bible, deciding there was a certain type of nation they wanted, and the forming of this country. It's not accidental. I deal with it. You see this in books all the time. They say, now from 1720s to 1770s was the Great Awakening, and another chapter says 1770s was the founding of the United States, as if those were 2 separate events. They are not. This nation was founded in the aftermath of a 50-year revival. Those are not separate. That's one story. In dark days, late 1700s, early 1800s, there was another sweeping revival. And a third national revival in the late 1800s. It's been over 100 years since we had a national revival, and I have to admit it shows. Different preachers disagree as to whether there can ever be another revival or not. I just believe that's a subject left up to the Lord and not to us to figure out. We ought to be in prayer for our leaders. We ought to be in prayer for our nation. We ought to stand up for what's right. We ought to be a part of promoting the righteousness that is in our nation and correcting when we can the sin that is in our nation. I don't believe the story has to be over. I do believe we're in desperate need of another revival. I understand the United States will not be here during the tribulation. But I want it to die the day of the rapture and not before. Okay? That's half history lesson, half Bible. But I believe it's an important thing for us to look at today. We need to educate ourselves to be as aware as we can. We need to be in prayer. We need to look to God to do something yet and to rescue our nation one more time. I close with one story about prayer. It goes back to the frontier. Daniel Boone, his brother Squire, started the First Baptist Church in the state of Kentucky, later started the First Baptist Church in the state of Indiana. But the original settlement at Boonesboro was almost all Baptists. They were surrounded in the famous battle about Boonesboro. And if you go to Boonesboro today, they'll tell you about the battle, but they won't tell you about the prayer. Folks keep leaving that out of the history stories. They're surrounded. The Indians, who are representing the British, are shooting fire arrows into the fort, setting it on fire. They haven't tried to put the fire out. They're digging tunnels, wanting to dig under the walls while they're putting out the fires. It looks so difficult that Squire Boone, who's the pastor, whose leg has been broken, has gathered the women and children around the powder magazine. They're praying for God to intervene. He's leading them in prayer, but he's got a lighted torch that if the Indians breach the wall, he will set fire to the powder magazine, killing all the women and children rather than letting them fall into the hands of the Indians. How's that for a pastor's job? How's that for a prayer meeting? Can you imagine those mothers holding their children, begging God to do something, being led in prayer by their preacher? And then an interesting thing happened. Thunderstorm came up out of nowhere. Rained so hard and so sudden, it put out all the fires they had started. Rained so hard and so sudden the ground absorbed the water and the tunnels all collapsed right outside the fort. And they began to look around, and the Indians were gone. And one of the Shawnee Indians would later explain it this way. The sun was shining, the sky was perfect, and the next moment there was a thunderstorm raining down so hard on them it knocked him out of the tree that he was in. The tunnels collapsed and the fires were out. And they talked among themselves and came to this conclusion that God was on the side of the people inside the fort, and they decided to leave. I'm just telling you, there's all kinds of stories about prayer like that. From Dunkirk and on. This is the heaven rescued land. No, it's not going to be rescued for the tribulation period. I got all that. Okay? But this is the heaven rescued land. And I feel real comfortable and responsible praying that God would rescue it yet again. I'll be real honest. I think it needs to be rescued. I think it's that bad. I think things are bad enough that only God can rescue it. But I'm real comfortable asking the Lord to do that again. He's made a habit out of it. And our foundation, righteousness. Our future, okay, I know what the ultimate future is. Take all the Christians out of this country, it'll collapse overnight. I got that. But between now and then, I think God's people have a responsibility. God bless y'all. Thank you for